You already know how to read people. You just forgot. Because life taught you to trust what they said, not what they showed when they thought no one was watching. But reading people isn't about judging them. It's about seeing the truth behind the mask and, most importantly, seeing the patterns they can't hide. Because words can lie. But behaviors, patterns, they never do. Think of all the times someone said, "I'm fine," but everything in their body screamed, "I'm not." Or when someone laughed a little too hard, changed the subject a little too fast, looked away a little too soon. That wasn't random. That was a confession. We live in a world where everyone's performing. Polished, curated, carefully filtered. But deep down beneath the armor, the noise, the smile, there's a human being just trying to survive the story they never chose. And that's the story this video is here to decode. In the next, I'll walk you through 18 psychological truths, insights drawn from Nietzsche, shadow psychology, and real-world behavior. Each truth will take you deeper, not just into others, but into yourself. Because to truly read people, you have to be willing to read your own patterns first. You'll start noticing things you've never seen before. And once you do, you can't unsee it. So if you've ever felt like something was off about someone, but couldn't explain why, you were right. You just didn't have the words for it. Until now. Let's begin. We all wear a mask, not because we're fake, but because the world never taught us how to feel safe without one. From the moment we're old enough to feel shame, we start shaping a version of ourselves, a version we think will be accepted, respected, or, at the very least, left alone. And here's the danger. Most people never realize they've become the mask. There isn't just one kind. Some wear the mask of politeness, smiling when they want to scream. Some wear the mask of strength, looking composed while silently falling apart. Others wear the mask of virtue, projecting goodness to hide the guilt they can't face. And then there's the most dangerous one of all, the mask of normalcy. The people who seem so well adjusted, so put together, so fine, you'd never think to look deeper. But it's behind that mask that the heaviest burdens are usually hiding. A man may walk into a room and dominate it with his charm, but that doesn't mean he's confident. It might just mean he learned long ago that being invisible was unbearable. So he became loud, so no one would forget him again. A woman may be endlessly kind, always accommodating. But it doesn't mean she's selfless. It might mean that rejection once shattered her, and now she'll trade authenticity for approval every time. The mistake isn't that people wear masks. The mistake is assuming that what you see is who they are. When you confuse the mask for the person, you stop seeing the real wounds. You stop hearing the silence behind their laughter. You miss the moment their voice shakes mid-sentence and chalk it up to just tired. But here's the twist. You do it too. We all do. You've worn masks to survive dinner tables where you couldn't be yourself. You've worn masks at jobs where being too honest was punished. You've smiled through pain, stayed silent through anger, and nodded through lies just to keep the peace. You didn't betray yourself. You adapted. But adaptation comes at a cost. And the longer you wear a mask, the harder it is to remember who you were before it. So if you want to start reading people, really reading them, don't just watch what they present. Watch what makes them twitch, because a mask may be made of smiles and gestures, but the truth always leaks through the cracks. And that brings us to the first real crack. What someone hates in others is almost always a mirror of what they can't face in themselves. Let's look at that next. Have you ever met someone who can't stop calling others arrogant? Someone who tears down every successful person, every confident voice, as if pride itself is a personal enemy. You might think they value humility, but look closer. You'll often find they're not disgusted by arrogance. They're terrified that deep down, they might be arrogant themselves. Or worse, that they'll never be good enough to be proud of anything at all. Nietzsche called this projection. Carl Jung built an entire psychological framework around it. But here's the simple truth behind the theory. What we can't face inside, we throw onto the outside. We exile parts of ourselves. Our anger, our jealousy, our insecurity. And then when we see those traits in someone else, we attack. We judge. We shame. Not because they're bad, but because they remind us of the parts of us we haven't come to terms with. A man who was raised to never cry might mock someone for being emotional, not because he's cruel, but because vulnerability triggers the version of himself he was taught to fear. It awakens a self he buried long ago. A woman who grew up believing beauty, famors nas worth, might silently resent someone confident in their skin, not because she hates them, but because that freedom reminds her of what she never felt allowed to claim. Projection is sneaky. It wears the mask of righteousness, of truth-telling, of just being honest, but behind that sharp tone is usually a wound. You're not just hearing opinion, you're hearing pain. And here's where it gets dangerous. If you're not aware of your own projections, you'll spend your whole life fighting shadows, pointing fingers, judging others for what you've refused to accept in yourself. So next time something really irritates you in someone else, what part of me is reacting right now? Is this about them or about something in me I've disowned? Because sometimes the people we criticize the most aren't reflections of who we hate, but of who we fear we've become. And if that fear is strong enough, we go silent. Not because we have nothing to say, but because saying it would mean exposing a truth we've buried too long. Which brings us to the next layer. Silence is not emptiness, it's avoidance. Let's go deeper. Most people are terrified of silence, not because it's empty, but because it's loud in a different way. You ask someone how they feel, and they pause. They look down. They say, "I'm fine," with a smile that doesn't reach their eyes. And then they change the subject. That isn't silence. That's a scream wrapped in stillness. Nietzsche didn't believe truth came from talking. He believed language was often used to distract, not to reveal. Because when you say nothing, you reveal everything you're trying to avoid. The pause, the deflection, the forced laugh. They are all signposts pointing toward the wound. Think of the friend who talks endlessly about their job, but always dodges questions about their relationship. Or the man who gives detailed opinions on politics, but shuts down when you ask about his father. Or the woman who never says no out loud, but flinches slightly when you ask too much of her. In every case, the silence isn't a void. It's a barrier, a wall built to protect something too raw to expose. Now let's be clear, silence isn't always trauma. Some silence is wisdom, contemplation, grace. But the silence we're talking about here, it's the kind that hurts to hold. It's the moment when someone's body freezes, but their mouth says, "It's okay." It's the tension behind a smile. It's the eye contact they avoid right when the truth is mentioned. These aren't random behaviors. They're messages, but only to those who are listening differently. When you truly start to read people, you stop chasing words and start watching for dissonance, where there's a gap between what's said and what's shown. There's usually a story no one's told yet, not even to themselves. And you've done this too, haven't you? You've nodded through betrayal. You've smiled in the face of disappointment. You've said, "I'm tired," instead of "I'm heartbroken." That's not weakness. That's survival. But what you bury in silence never truly disappears. It just becomes harder to hear yourself. And in that silence, sometimes people reach for something louder, something that feels safe, something that can hide the pain, morality, virtue, righteousness, not because they're good, but because they're scared to be seen as bad. Let's look at how that mask works next. Be careful with the people who always talk about what's right, who preach kindness, decency, honesty, like a sermon on repeat. Because sometimes, the louder the morality, the deeper the insecurity behind it. Real virtue doesn't need to announce itself. It moves quietly. It shows up when no one's watching. It chooses compassion when revenge would be easier. It forgives without needing an audience. But when someone's moral compass is broadcasted, declared, marketed, when it becomes a public performance instead of a private principle, you have to ask, who are they trying to convince you? Or themselves? The person who constantly corrects others for being insensitive often hides their own unresolved anger. The influencer who floods your feed with messages of love and positivity sometimes can't stand to be alone with their own thoughts. The boss who lectures about accountability might be the one who's terrified of being exposed for their own hypocrisy. It's not that these people are evil. They're human. And like all of us, they build masks. But their mask happens to look righteous. Nietzsche saw this as the will to power in disguise, a way to dominate not through brute force, but through moral high ground. Because if you stand above everyone else, you don't have to face what's beneath your own surface. And this is where it gets painful. Many people cling to morality not because they're proud, but because they're ashamed. Ashamed of who they were. Ashamed of what they've done. Ashamed of how little they feel inside. So they build a fortress out of values. They hide in the language of virtue. And they point fingers not to teach others, but to distract from the chaos inside themselves. You might have done this too. Held others to standards you couldn't meet. Preached forgiveness while carrying resentment. Projected strength while falling apart quietly. It's okay. It means you're human. But awareness is where freedom begins. Because when you stop performing goodness, you create space to actually become it. But there's one form of dishonesty even deeper than moral performance. And that's the lie we tell every day, not to the world, but to ourselves. Let's talk about that next. No one wakes up one day and decides to become a liar. It doesn't happen in a single moment. It happens in fragments, small compromises, tiny silences, unspoken truths we tuck under the rug just for one more day of peace. And before we know it, we're living a version of ourselves we no longer recognize. Nietzsche once said, "The lie is a condition of life. He didn't mean it with malice. He meant it with sorrow. Because the human mind, when pushed to its limits, will choose illusion over collapse. We lie to keep functioning, to protect the ego, to preserve the illusion of control. A woman says, "I'm over him," but her heart still sinks when she sees his name. A man says, "This job is fine," but he dies a little more each Monday morning. A parent says, "I did the best I could," but still wakes up at 2 a.m., haunted by the words they never said. These aren't lies meant to hurt others. They're lies we repeat so often, we start believing them ourselves. And that's what makes self-deception so dangerous. We don't even know we're doing it. We rewrite the story to survive it. In psychology, it's called cognitive dissonance, the unbearable gap between what we believe and how we behave. So we adjust the belief. We reshape the memory. We bend the truth, not to deceive others, but to keep our world from falling apart. You've likely felt it before. The subtle disconnection between who you are and who you pretend to be. The smile that doesn't belong to your mood. The silence you held when you should have screamed. The sentence you told yourself just to get through the day. These aren't failures. They're survival tactics. But survival isn't the same as living. And every lie we tell ourselves pulls us further from the truth we're actually seeking: peace, wholeness, alignment. But here's the beauty of catching yourself in a lie. It means something inside you is still awake, still reaching for truth. And the first step to reading others is learning to hear the moment their story stops adding up. Not because they're trying to trick you, but because they've been tricking themselves for years. But when those cracks begin to show, when their voice falters or their tone shifts, something powerful emerges. A glimpse into the wound they've been trying to outrun. And that glimpse, that's where we're going next. Some people walk into a room and take it over. They speak with certainty, move with dominance. They make you feel like they know what's right, what's best, what's true. But look closer, not with your eyes, with your intuition. Because the louder someone needs to feel above others, the more likely they're terrified of being seen as beneath them. True confidence doesn't compete. It doesn't need to prove anything. It just is. But superiority, that's different. It's loud, defensive, controlling. And underneath it, you'll often find something fragile. A childhood wound, a buried humiliation, a silent belief that says, if I'm not the best, I'll be nothing at all. The man who constantly reminds you of his success might still hear his father's voice telling him he'll never measure up. The woman who corrects everyone in the room might be terrified that if she's not right, she'll be abandoned. The colleague who makes every meeting about them might be masking a deep fear of being invisible. It's not about arrogance, it's about fear. Carl Jung once wrote, "Where love rules, there is no will to power. And where power predominates, love is lacking." Superiority isn't power. It's the absence of love, especially self-love. It's the frantic attempt to fill a void by standing on top of others, instead of turning inward and facing what's broken. Ask yourself, have you ever needed to be the smartest person in the room? To be respected, feared, admired, just to feel okay? That wasn't confidence. That was armor. And like all armor, it gets heavy. Eventually, the weight of trying to be more than crushes the part of you that just wants to be enough. And here's the paradox. The people who appear the strongest are often the most afraid of being truly seen. Because to be seen is to risk being judged, rejected, or worse, exposed. But the moment you realize that superiority is a shield, not a sign of strength, you begin to see people differently, not as threats, but as scared children pretending to be kings. And when that mask of dominance starts to crack, when someone overreacts, overexplains, overpromises what you're witnessing, isn't power leaking out, it's fear flooding in. And that leads us to the next layer. Most actions aren't driven by desire. They're driven by unconscious fear. Let's keep going. We like to think people act from desire, that they chase goals, pursue love, build dreams because they want something better. But most people aren't driven by what they want. They're pushed by what they fear. They say yes when they want to say no because they're afraid of being rejected. They work late, stay quiet, avoid confrontation, not because it's noble, but because the silence feels safer than disapproval. Even ambition, what we praise as hunger, is often just a sophisticated form of fear. Fear of being average, fear of being forgotten, fear of becoming nothing at all. If you truly want to read someone, don't just ask what they're chasing. Ask what would collapse in them if they didn't have this, because that's where the truth lives. Not in the want, but in the threat behind it. The man who dominates every room. He's not chasing power. He's terrified of powerlessness. The woman who micromanages her life to perfection. She's not addicted to order. She's afraid of inner chaos breaking through. The friend who keeps over-explaining every mistake. They're not looking for clarity. They're terrified you'll leave if they don't explain it just right. In trauma, psychology, it's called hypervigilance. You become so used to pain, so used to danger, that you start seeing it everywhere, even when it's not there. So your life stops being a journey and starts becoming a defense strategy. Every smile, every answer, every yes becomes a move on a chessboard of self-protection. And you've done this too, haven't you? Said what someone wanted to hear, not because it was true, but because disagreement felt dangerous. You've delayed things, avoided things, not out of laziness, but out of fear. Fear of judgment, fear of failure, fear of facing something in yourself that you weren't ready to meet yet. So here's the truth. No one teaches you. If you really want to understand someone, don't ask what motivates them. Ask what terrifies them. Because most people don't run toward dreams. They run away from demons. And sometimes those fears become habits. They turn into patterns of behavior, especially in how we see others. And one of the most common patterns, criticism. But what if criticism isn't clarity? What if it's confession? Let's go there next. We've all met them people who can't help but point out what's wrong. With politics, with society, with you. They're quick to notice mistakes, quick to comment, quick to correct, and on the surface, it seems like clarity, like sharp thinking, like discernment. But behind the sharpness, there's often something else, a wound. Nietzsche said, all truly great thoughts are conceived while walking. But most criticism, it's not born from clarity. It's born from fear, from envy, from pain we don't know how to process. So we turn it outward. The man who constantly mocks emotional people was likely punished for crying as a boy. The woman who shames others for being fake might still hate the parts of herself she had to hide to be accepted. The colleague who belittles everyone's ideas might have grown up in a house where their voice was never heard. Criticism, when it's compulsive, relentless, or disproportionate, is rarely about the other person. It's about the critic, its projection, its deflection. It's the psyche saying, I can't stand this trait in me, so I'll fight it in you. Constructive feedback comes from clarity, but persistent criticism, it comes from chaos. The difference is energy. One aims to help. The other aims to unload. Have you ever caught yourself judging someone quickly, then later realized you were really just uncomfortable with yourself? Maybe you scoffed at someone's vulnerability because you didn't feel safe enough to show your own. Maybe you rolled your eyes at someone's confidence because you've spent years doubting yours. Criticism is a mirror. And the more it hurts to look at, the more it's showing you. So the next time someone's words sting, ask yourself, what pain are they trying to mask with that sharpness? What truth in me is being touched by their reaction? Because when you see criticism as a confession, you stop reacting with ego and start responding with insight. But not all masks are verbal. Some are deeper, heavier, quieter, and one of the most deceptive, confidence. Because sometimes the person who seems most sure of themselves is the one carrying the heaviest guilt. Let's uncover that next. You've seen them, the ones who never hesitate, who speak in absolutes, who always have the answer even before the question is fully asked. They appear solid, unshakable, confident. But here's the question no one thinks to ask. Why do they need to be? What would happen if they ever said, I don't know? Or worse, I was wrong. Because sometimes behind the voice that never wavers is a guilt that never left. Not guilt about something they did, but guilt about something they still carry. A failure, a betrayal, a mistake that cracked their image of themselves. One they've spent years trying to outrun, and so they built a fortress of certainty. Not to show the world they're strong, but to convince themselves they've changed. The teacher who's aggressively right about everything may still be haunted by a time they were humiliated for getting it wrong. The father who never apologizes might still carry shame over the man he used to be. The woman who always knows better than everyone else might be trying to silence the part of her that feels like she's never enough. They wear confidence like armor, but inside, they're still bleeding. Jung called this the persona of overcompensation, where the self fractured by guilt or shame creates an opposite self-image so strong it becomes almost theatrical. But no matter how perfect the performance, the body still remembers. The nervous jaw, the clenched fist, the rehearsed tone. Certainty becomes a script, and truth gets buried under the need to never feel small again. So ask yourself, has there ever been a time where you acted like you had it all figured out, just so no one would see how lost you really were? Have you ever doubled down on a lie not because you believed it, but because you couldn't bear to face what it would mean if you didn't? That's not ego. That's guilt. And guilt unspoken always disguises itself as control. And here's the compassion. We all do this. When the weight of shame becomes too much, we don't crumble. We compensate. We raise our voice. We tighten our smile. We polish the surface so no one sees the cracks. But just because someone sounds certain doesn't mean they're at peace. And often, the louder the claim, the more it reveals what's being silenced underneath. Which brings us to something even subtler: exaggeration. Not just in tone, but in identity. Because when someone says, "I never care what people think," you can almost guarantee they care more than anyone. Let's explore that next. Listen closely next time someone says, "I don't care what anyone thinks," or "I'm always happy. I never get jealous. I'm totally over it." The truth, they probably care. They're probably not happy. They're probably still hurting. Because the louder the claim, the more likely it's covering something they're terrified to admit. Exaggeration isn't just a way to convince you. It's a way to convince themselves. The psyche, when under pressure, doesn't whisper reassurance. It screams it. It overstates. It makes bold, sweeping declarations because underneath there's a voice whispering the opposite. And that voice, it's not trying to be dramatic. It's trying not to drown. The person who says, "I love being single, I never want a relationship," might be masking heartbreak they never processed. The guy who brags, "I don't need anyone," might be aching for connection, but too afraid to trust. The coworker who constantly talks about how fine they are may be the one struggling the most when they go home. They exaggerate strength, not to deceive, but to protect the version of themselves that still feels weak. Nietzsche believed that extremes are rarely a sign of balance. They're often evidence of something unresolved. Jung went further. The greater the outward show of power, the greater the inner need for reassurance. Exaggeration then becomes a volume dial for the ego. It turns itself up to drown out self-doubt. It repeats affirmations not as celebration, but as a shield against inner contradiction. Have you ever over-explained how much something didn't matter just because it actually mattered a lot? Have you ever posted the happiest picture of your life right after your worst day? That wasn't manipulation. That was the survival instinct trying to stay in control of the narrative. We all do it. The key is noticing it, not in others first, but in ourselves. Because the parts we exaggerate are often the parts we haven't accepted yet. And sometimes, when exaggeration doesn't work, we double down in a different way through control. Not because we love order, but because the idea of losing control feels unbearable. Let's uncover that next. Some people control everything: their calendar, their image, their home, their kids, their words, their weight, even how others perceive their silence. It looks like discipline, like precision, like power, but look underneath. That hunger for control often hides a much deeper fear, the fear of inner chaos. Because when the inside feels messy, confusing, overwhelming, the outside becomes a battlefield of micromanagement. You obsess over structure. You perfect your routines. You chase certainty like it's oxygen, not because you're organized, but because without that scaffolding, you're afraid the whole thing might fall apart. The parent who can't stand noise in the house might be trying to silence the emotional noise they've never processed. The manager who triple checks every task might be terrified of being blamed again like they were as a child. The partner who needs to control every detail of the vacation might have grown up in a world where unpredictability sections danger. So now chaos isn't just discomfort, it's threat. Carl Jung believed that what we reject internally, we project externally. Nietzsche saw obsessive order not as strength, but as a sign of existential fear. Because real peace isn't clean. It's not perfectly timed or symmetrical. It's stable in the face of uncertainty, not dependent on the absence of it. And If you've ever felt this too, you know, it's exhausting. Holding it all together. Planning every move. Fixating on what could go wrong before it even does. But here's what no one tells you. The more tightly you grip everything outside of you, the more out of control things usually are inside of you. Control isn't bad. Structure is healthy. But when it becomes a prison, when you can't let go without spiraling, that's no longer order. That's survival mode disguised as excellence. And people trapped in that mindset don't need more discipline. They need permission to stop running. Because at some point, control stops being about safety and starts becoming a performance. And when life becomes a performance, what you're really watching isn't a person thriving. It's someone trying not to fall apart while everyone's watching. Let's talk about that next. Scroll through your feed. Perfect bodies. Perfect smiles. Perfect mornings with perfect lighting. Everyone's performing. Everyone's trying to be something. But what if the people who need to be seen the most are the ones who feel the least visible inside? What if the performance isn't a celebration of confidence, but a cry for meaning? There's a difference between expression and exhibition. One is rooted in self-awareness, the other in self-abandonment. Because when your worth depends on applause, when your sense of self flickers based on validation, you're no longer living. You're acting. And no matter how polished the act, your soul knows it's not real. The influencer who posts daily affirmations but can't look in the mirror without filters. The entrepreneur who constantly preaches hustle but feels empty when the phone stops ringing. The person who always has it together but avoids silence like it's poison. They aren't thriving. They're performing resilience. Because deep down, they fear who they are without the spotlight. Nietzsche warned about this. He saw that in a world obsessed with image, many people would become actors of the self. They don't lie maliciously. They lie because they're scared of being forgotten, of being unwanted, of being unseen. So they fill the void with content, with noise, with "look at me." Jung would call this the inflated persona, a mask so overdeveloped that it swallows the real self. And the tragedy, the more you perform, the more disconnected you become from your core, your stillness, your shadow, your truth, the very things that make you human. And you've probably done it too. Put on the smile, shared the highlight reel, said "I'm good" even when you weren't. Because sometimes it's easier to seem okay than to admit you're not sure who you are without the show. But performing your way through life doesn't heal what's hollow. It only hides it longer. And when that mask gets heavy, when the applause stops, many people spiral. Because what they built their identity on was never solid to begin with. And in that collapse, something deeper is revealed. The wound behind their worldview. The beliefs they hold aren't built from reason, but from pain. Let's dig into that next. We like to believe we're logical, that we form opinions through reason, that we choose beliefs like scientists examining facts, weighing outcomes, adjusting as needed. But the truth is far more human and far more vulnerable. Most people don't speak from logic. They speak from pain. Their arguments are not calculations. They're confessions. Behind every strong opinion, there's usually a wound. Behind every "I don't believe in love," there's a heartbreak that never healed. Behind every "the world is just corrupt," there's a betrayal that shattered trust. People don't build beliefs from scratch. They build them from survival. from what hurt them, from what scared them, from what they never want to feel again. A man who insists emotions are weakness might have been punished for crying as a boy. So now he worships logic, not because it's true, but because it's safe. A woman who says, "I don't believe in commitment," might not be cold. She might just still be haunted by the moment someone she loved walked away without warning. And someone who tells you, "Trust no one isn't cynical," they're wounded. And their belief is a bandage. Jung believed that our beliefs often originate in the unconscious. We justify them with logic after the emotion has already settled in. That's why arguments often feel so personal, even when they're about abstract ideas, because beneath the logic is someone trying not to bleed. And you've likely done it too, held on to a worldview, not because it served you, but because letting it go would mean facing a part of yourself you weren't ready to revisit. Maybe you defended something not because it was right, but because changing your mind would mean admitting you were wrong when it really mattered. That's not intellectual dishonesty. That's emotional protection. So when someone argues, when they raise their voice or shut down or fight back too hard, don't just listen to what they say. Ask, what part of them is trying to stay safe? What are they afraid would happen if they believed something else? Because at the end of the day, belief is rarely about facts. It's about fear. And once you realize that, you stop fighting for truth and start searching for the wound underneath it. And when someone can't tolerate weakness in others, when they mock, punish, or dominate the vulnerable, they're not showing strength. They're revealing something even deeper, how they were taught to treat the weak inside themselves. Let's talk about that next. If you want to know who someone really is, don't watch how they act around the powerful. Watch how they treat someone who can't fight back. Because it's easy to be kind when it costs you nothing. It's easy to smile when you're winning. But real character is revealed when you have the power to harm and choose not to. People often confuse dominance with strength, but strength isn't in the volume of your voice. It's in the depth of your restraint. It's in the moment you could belittle someone, but choose to understand instead. It's when you could punish, but pause, listen, and remember what it felt like to be on the other side of that pain. The boss who humiliates a junior employee in front of everyone isn't strong. He's insecure, still trying to rewrite the script of his own childhood shame. The friend who mocks others for being too sensitive might be terrified of their own emotional vulnerability. The parent who demands perfection from their child might still be haunted by the fear of disappointing someone who never forgave them. Carl Jung believed that we often act out the very trauma we never healed. If we were punished for being weak, we grow up punishing others for showing it, not because we hate them, but because we see ourselves in their eyes. And it hurts. So ask yourself, what do you do when someone drops the act, when they cry in front of you, make a mistake, tell you they're not okay? Do you lean in or pull away? Do you fix or do you listen? Because your reaction to weakness doesn't reveal them, it reveals you. Real strength is soft. It holds space. It doesn't need to control or correct or dominate. It allows others to be human because it no longer fears its own humanity. And that is the kind of power that can't be faked. It doesn't shout. It doesn't need applause. It simply exists unshaken, grounded, and free. But some people aren't grounded. They're starving, not for control, not for truth, but for attention. Because somewhere in their past, they were forgotten. And now, they'll do anything to make sure they're never invisible again. Let's uncover that next. Some people enter a room and need to be seen. They tell the loudest story, wear the brightest outfit, turn every moment into a stage. At first glance, it looks like confidence. But if you listen closely, really listen, what you'll hear is not self-assurance, it's fear. The fear of being invisible, of being forgotten. This isn't about vanity, it's about memory. Because when someone has been emotionally abandoned, especially as a child, they carry a quiet terror that if they're not loud, not special, not needed, they'll be erased, not by death, but by indifference. The friend who posts every detail of their day might just be craving proof that someone out there is paying attention. The coworker who constantly interrupts might be trying to outrun the echo of years spent being ignored. The woman who's always too much, too loud, too bold, too visible, might have once been a little girl no one saw. In trauma psychology, this is known as the anxious attachment echo, where early neglect wires the brain to believe, if I'm not remarkable, I'm disposable. So they seek attention not as ego, but as oxygen, because silence feels like death. Carl Jung would call this the orphan shadow, the inner child who was never truly witnessed. And now in adulthood, that shadow cries out through performance, through chaos, through drama, not to impress, but to be remembered. And maybe you felt it too. That ache when no one texts back, that strange emptiness after a post gets ignored, that sudden need to make noise, just to prove you're still here. That's not weakness. That's a survival instinct. It's your inner child saying, please don't forget me again. So when you see someone acting extra, before you roll your eyes, or call them attention-seeking pause, ask, what would happen to them if no one noticed? What part of them is trying not to disappear? Because sometimes the person trying hardest to be seen is the one who spent their whole life feeling invisible. And sometimes that visibility becomes unbearable, especially when someone else has what we secretly want. So instead of reaching for it, we tear it down. Because when envy gets too painful to hold, we turn it into attack. Let's explore that next. There's a strange irony in human nature. We don't always attack what we fear. Sometimes we attack what we secretly desire, but believe we'll never have. It's not hatred. It's envy, dressed in armor, disguised as contempt. You see it in small ways. The passive-aggressive comment, the sarcastic jab, the backhanded compliment that cuts more than it flatters. On the surface, it looks like mockery, but underneath, there's a longing, a quiet, painful whisper. I wish I could be like that. But I've already decided I can't. So instead of reaching for it, they reach for the knife. The man who mocks someone's success isn't always proud of where he is. He just can't admit he gave up on his dreams. The woman who gossips about someone's confidence might be mourning the version of herself that never got to shine. The friend who rolls their eyes at your joy might still be grieving the joy they were once denied. Nietzsche understood this distortion well. He believed that people project their unrealized potential onto those who have become what they buried. But instead of facing that grief, they twist it. They tell themselves the other person is fake, arrogant, lucky, unworthy. Because admitting I want that too requires confronting the pain of never allowing yourself to try. Jung saw envy as a mirror to the shadow. Not the dark part of you that's evil, but the repressed part, the one that wanted to grow but wasn't allowed. And when someone embodies that shadow for you, freedom, boldness, ease, you don't just see them. You see the life you could have lived but didn't. That pain is unbearable. So, instead of facing it, we attack. And have you ever disliked someone so intensely you couldn't even explain why? Look closer. Were they loud in a way you've always silenced yourself? Were they free in ways you've always feared to be? Sometimes, the people we resent most aren't reflections of what we hate, but of what we lost, or never gave ourselves permission to become. So when you feel that sting of envy, pause. Don't judge it. Trace it. Ask, what do I see in them that I've been afraid to claim in me? Because the moment you turn envy into awareness, it becomes a compass, not a curse. But for many people, that envy never gets explored. It gets buried. And buried emotions always find a way out, especially in adulthood, because most people don't act from belief. They act from memory. They're not responding to you. They're reenacting the roles they were once forced to play. Let's go there next. People say, I believe in independence. But when conflict shows up, they shut down. They say, I value honesty, but avoid difficult truths at all costs. They say, I choose calm, but explode when their authority is questioned. It's not hypocrisy. It's not contradiction. It's memory. Most people don't act from beliefs. They act from conditioning, from the roles they learned to play long before they knew they were playing them. Their behaviors aren't chosen. They're repeated. Like loops in a song no one remembers writing. The man who always withdraws in conflict might have learned that in his home raising your voice led to danger. The woman who keeps fixing broken people might have spent her childhood caretaking emotionally unavailable parents. The friend who always needs to be right might have grown up in a house where being wrong meant being humiliated. They're not acting from today. They're reacting from back then. Carl Jung called these unconscious roles complexes, emotional patterns so deeply embedded they hijack the present and replay the past. He believed most adults are carrying an inner child still waiting to feel safe, still waiting to be heard, still reenacting the only script they were ever handed. And until that child is acknowledged, the loop continues. What about you? Think about the last time you overreacted. Not just frustration, but that disproportionate sting, that rage, that shutdown. What age were you emotionally in that moment? Were you really 32 or were you 9 again? Trying to avoid shame, trying to stay invisible, trying to earn love just like you used to. When you realize most people are acting out their unhealed stories, you start seeing them differently. That strict boss might be a terrified child trying to feel in control for once. That cold partner might be protecting a heart that was never safe to open. That emotionally distant friend might have grown up in a house where no one asked, "How are you really?" They're not stubborn. They're scared. And they've been scared for a long time. And if you pay close attention, you'll realize one last thing. People don't always know how to say what hurt them, but they'll show you again and again through their patterns, because in the end, behavior is confession. Let's finish with that. People don't always know how to speak their truth, but they always show it in how they move, in what they repeat, in what they avoid, because behind every pattern is a story that never got finished, a pain that was never named, a need that was never met. And that pattern is their confession, the person who ghosts. When things get too close, they're not cold. They're terrified of being abandoned again, so they leave first. The one who overworks endlessly, they're not driven. They're trying to outrun the silence they were raised in. The flirt who connects with everyone, but lets no one in, isn't careless. They're protecting a heart that's never really healed. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." What he meant is this: people act out their wounds over and over until someone sees it, until they see it. And until then, the pattern is the language, the avoidance, the sarcasm, the silence, the repetition. These are not just habits. They are messages, spoken in code, screaming to be decoded. And you, what patterns have you lived out on? Loop. What roles have you been playing? Not because they're who you are, but because they're what kept you safe. What have you chased? Not because you wanted it, but because you were running from something else. What have you hated in others that you were too afraid to acknowledge in yourself? What story are you still stuck inside? Because the more you see it in others, the clearer it becomes in you. This is the real gift of learning to read people, not to judge, not to manipulate, not to stay one step ahead, but to understand, to look past the mask into the wound, and offer what the world rarely does: grace. When you see someone clearly, you stop personalizing their pain. You stop internalizing their chaos. You stop reacting to their mask and start witnessing their humanity. And that is what makes you powerful. Not because you can control others, but because you no longer need to. You become the calm in a room full of noise, the mirror in a world full of projections, the clarity in a sea of masks. Now take a breath, reflect. Every truth in this journey wasn't just about them. It was about you, your patterns, your shadows, your story. This isn't the end. It's a beginning, a new way of seeing, and maybe a new way of being. You've made it to the end. But this wasn't just a list of insights. It was a mirror, because to read others clearly, you must be brave enough to read yourself. The masks, the patterns, the fears you didn't realize were still writing your script. Nietzsche didn't just want you to see through people. He wanted you to stop being fooled, not by them, but by your own unhealed story. So now I ask you, which of these 18 truths hit you the hardest? Which one made you pause and realize you've been carrying it too? Let me know in the comments. Because when we start speaking these truths out loud, we stop being prisoners of them. And if this video helped you see people differently, helped you see yourself differently, subscribe. This journey is far from over. There are still deeper shadows to explore, more illusions to break, and more power to reclaim. The kind that comes not from control, but from understanding. Welcome to a new way of seeing.